It wasn't like a movie. There were no fireballs or heroic cries. There was only sound, a short, dry crack, like someone breaking a pencil near my ear. It was a broken wing spar, and then chaos ensued. My Cessna 182 began to spin like a paper airplane in a storm. I could see the mountains coming toward me, swirling around the windshield. I remember my last thought before impact. I never turned off the stove at home. It's absurd, but the brain clings to little things when the scale of the disaster becomes too great. Then there was silence, so deep that I could hear the metal of the engine cooling. Clack, 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 clack. I was strapped to the chair, hanging upside down. Blood rushed to my head, and my left leg, I couldn't feel it. Or rather, I felt a hot throb instead, as if someone had plunged my shin into molten lead. It took me 3 hours just to unbuckle my seatbelt. When I hit the ceiling of the cabin, I passed out from the pain. When I opened my eyes, the sun was already touching the horizon. The temperature was dropping. The Arctic doesn't wait for you to wake up, it just starts digesting you. The first morning greeted me with frost on my eyelashes. My breath froze in the air, turning to icy dust. I knew that if I stayed in the cockpit, it would be my coffin. Metal sucked heat out of my body faster than ice. I crawled out through the broken side window. The snow was deep and dry as flour. I looked down at my leg. My trouser leg was torn, and a sharp white shard of my own bone was sticking out through the fabric. I couldn't scream. My throat was too dry. I knew the rule of threes: 3 minutes without air, 3 hours without shelter, 3 days without water. I had no shelter. I used a crash axe to cut off a piece of wing skin. I made a sort of leg splint out of it, wrapping it with electrical tape and seat belts. Every turn of the tape made me bite my lips until they bled, lest I faint again. That night, I realized the most terrible thing. My radio beacon had been shattered on impact. I was a ghost in an ocean of white. On the fourth day, the thirst became unbearable. The surface of my tongue became as dry as sandpaper. I tried to eat snow, but that was a mistake. After an hour, I began to shake so badly that I could not hold the axe. The snow was lowering the temperature of my insides. I needed fire. There was still some fuel left in the plane's tanks, but how can I get it? I used an empty windshield washer bottle, tied it to a stick, and pushed it into the gas tank cut. I got out a half-liter of aviation gasoline. Now a spark. I had only 3 matches in a sealed package. Only 3 chances at life. The first match broke in my frozen fingers. I cried, not because of the match, but because of how helpless I had become. The second match caught fire, but a gust of wind extinguished it in a second. The last one remained. I took off my cotton t-shirt, tore it into shreds, soaked it in gasoline, and covered it with dry brushwood I had spent half a day gathering, crawling on my elbows around the plane. I covered the fire with my body. I held my breath. Chirp, a small yellow flame caught the fabric. The gasoline flared up with blue fire. I felt warmth on my face, and for the first time in 4 days, I felt I could win. I melted the snow in the lid of a saucepan I had found in the trunk. The first sip of warm water was better than the best wine in the world. A week passed. There were no rescue planes. The sky was clear but dead. I began to notice that the silence had a sound. It was a low hum in my ears that grew louder as I stopped moving. My diet consisted of tea I made from needles and dwarf birch bark. My brain began to play games with me. I heard someone calling my name. I turned around, but all I could see were endless drifts of snow and black rocks on the horizon. I realized that I needed to keep a schedule. I began to cut notches into the fuselage of the plane. 7 notches. Each one was a victory. I talked to the plane. I called it Old Max. Well, Max, I said, stroking the cold iron, we're still here today. We'll see tomorrow. On the 10th night, I'd heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of heavy breathing right next to my makeshift igloo under the wing. Then the sound of claws on metal. The wolf. He was alone. At least I could see only one pair of yellow eyes in the light of my small fire. He was exhausted, as was I. We stared at each other for 10 long minutes. I had a knife in my hand, tied to a stick, but I knew that if he attacked, I didn't stand a chance. My leg made me easy prey. I did something I didn't expect myself to do. I started to growl. I screamed, waving the burning branch, using every ounce of rage I had left. The wolf backed away. He disappeared into the darkness, but I knew he wasn't gone for good. He was just waiting for my fire to die down. I didn't sleep that night. I realized that I was no longer a pilot. I am not a man from the 21st century. I have become a beast fighting for territory at the edge of the world, and I was not going to give it up without a fight. By the 11th day, my body had finished consuming its stores of fat. I could feel my organs beginning to tighten, pulling energy from the muscle of my arms. My ribs were no longer hidden. They were a cage pressing against the inside of my skin. Hunger isn't a sharp pain after the first week. It's a hollow, echoing ache. It makes your mind wander to the strangest things. I spent 6 hours staring at a rusted bolt on the engine manifold, imagining it was a piece of chocolate. I could almost smell it. I could feel the texture of the foil. When I reached out to touch it, the searing cold of the metal snapped me back to reality, tearing a layer of skin from my fingertip. The sun returned with a vengeance on the 14th day. It bounced off the endless white plains, magnifying the glare until the world turned into a searing, featureless void. I had no sunglasses. Within hours, my eyes felt like they were filled with hot sand. I was going blind. I remembered an old Inuit trick. I found a piece of birch bark and cut two tiny slits into it, then tied it around my head with a strip of seatbelt. It narrowed my vision, protecting my retinas from the ultraviolet burn. For 3 days, I lived in a world of slivers, seeing only what was directly in front of me. It made the isolation worse. I felt like I was living inside a cardboard box, listening to the wind scream against the walls. This was the day the ghost arrived. I was sitting by my tiny fire, trying to melt the last of the frozen engine oil to use as a signal flare, when I looked across the clearing. There, sitting on a drift of snow, was a man. He wore a heavy wool coat, the kind sailors wore in the 40s. He didn't have a face exactly, just a shadow where his features should be. "You're not here," I whispered, my voice sounding like dry leaves. The man didn't move. He pointed toward the horizon, where the mountains met the gray sky. "There's nothing there," I argued. "Just more white, just more death." But the ghost stayed. He became my silent companion. I began to tell him things I had never told anyone. I told him about the girl I had let walk away 5 years ago. I told him about the father I hadn't called in months. The ghost was a good listener. He kept me from the most dangerous thing in the Arctic, the silence of one's own mind. My strength was failing. I couldn't even stand on my good leg anymore. If I didn't find protein, I was going to die in my sleep. I looked at the wreckage of the Cessna, my old Max. I saw the thin wires from the radio system. I spent 4 hours, my fingers bleeding and numb, twisting the wire into small loops, snares. I dragged myself on my belly, a few inches at a time, to a cluster of bushes where I had seen tiny tracks in the snow. I set 3 snares. That night, I prayed for the first time in a decade, not for rescue, but for a life to take so that mine could continue. In the morning, the second snare was tight. A snowshoe hare, white as a cloud, was caught in the wire. I cried when I killed it. I thanked it. I ate the liver raw while it was still warm, feeling the energy hit my bloodstream like an electric shock. It was the most visceral moment of my life. I wasn't an accountant or a pilot anymore. I was a predator. My gums started to bleed today. When I spit into the snow, it was pink, scurvy. I knew I needed vitamin C, but there were no oranges in the Yukon. I remembered reading about explorers who survived by boiling the needles of the black spruce tree. I gathered a handful of needles, bitter and sharp, and brewed a thick, oily tea. It tasted like turpentine. It made me vomit the first time, but I forced it down. I spent the rest of the day carving my mother's name into the aluminum wing. It was a slow process. Every scratch of the knife felt like it took a year off my life, but I had to leave a record. If the white void claimed me, I wanted someone to know that I had fought for every second. The wind changed on the 25th night. It wasn't the usual northern gale. It was a warm, wet breeze from the south, a chinook. Within hours, the temperature rose. The snow began to soften, turning into a heavy, slushy mess. I heard the sound of a distant rumble, an avalanche in the mountains. For the first time, I smelled something other than ice. I smelled the earth. Time to go, Arthur. The ghost in the wool coat whispered, or perhaps it was just the wind. I looked at my leg. The swelling had gone down, but it was still useless. I looked at the horizon. I knew that the search parties had likely given up weeks ago. If I was going to be saved, I had to move. I couldn't wait for the world to find me. I had to go back to the world. The Chinook wind had turned my world into a swamp of slush and mud. The shelter I had built under the wing of the Cessna, my home for nearly a month, was collapsing. I looked at the fuselage of the plane, now stripped of its wiring, its upholstery, and its dignity. I can't stay here anymore, Max, I whispered. I spent the morning preparing for the end. I fashioned a sled out of a piece of the engine cowling, lashing my remaining supplies to it with seat belts. I took the flare gun, the last of the spruce needle tea, and a small photograph of my family I had found wedged behind the instrument panel. I didn't walk away. I couldn't. I rolled out of the cockpit and onto my belly. I began to crawl. Distance is a different concept when you are on your hands and knees. 100 yards feels like a marathon. A mile is a continent. My world was reduced to the 6 inches of mud and melting ice directly in front of my face. I developed a rhythm: reach, pull, drag, rest. My fingernails were gone, replaced by raw, bleeding quicks. My knees were shredded despite the padding I had made from the plane's insulation. Every time I stopped, the ghost in the wool coat was there. He didn't sit anymore. He walked ahead of me, always 10 paces away, silent and judging. Keep moving, Arthur, the silence seemed to say. The river doesn't come to the mountain goes to the river. On the 34th day, the rain began. Not the soft mist of spring, but a cold, driving deluge that soaked through my flight jacket in minutes. My broken leg was a constant screaming passenger. The bone had begun to knit, but it had set crookedly, a jagged lump under the skin that caught on every rock and root. I became delirious. I began to sing hymns I hadn't heard since childhood. I laughed at the absurdity of it all. A man who flew over the world, now reduced to the speed of a snail. That night, I reached the edge of the plateau. Below me, a mile away, was the Mackenzie River. It was a dark, churning ribbon of ice and water, but it was moving. It was the road out of the void. I had reached the riverbank, but I was spent. I had no more strength to pull the sled. I lay in the mud, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. My eyes were sunken, my skin a sickly shade of gray. I looked like a corpse that hadn't realized it was dead yet. Then I heard it, a low rhythmic thrumming. At first I thought it was the ghost talking again, but then the vibration hit my chest. A bush plane, a de Havilland Beaver, flying low along the river corridor, likely a local mail run or a supply flight. I reached for the flare gun. My hands were shaking so violently I nearly dropped it. I had one shot, only one. If I fired too early, the pilot wouldn't see it against the gray clouds. If I fired too late, he'd be over the ridge. I waited until the sound was deafening. I pointed the plastic orange gun at the sky and pulled the trigger. POP. The red sparks soared into the air, a tiny defiant scream of color in a world of gray. I watched it rise, and then I watched the plane continue to fly. It didn't turn, it didn't dip its wings, it disappeared over the trees. I put my head in the mud and gave up. I closed my eyes and waited for the ghost to finally take my hand. I don't know how long I was unconscious. I was dreaming of a kitchen, the smell of frying bacon, and the sound of a radio playing a baseball game. It was so warm. Then something cold touched my cheek. It wasn't the ghost, it was a hand, a gloved human hand. Hey, I found him. Over here. He's alive. My God, he's alive. I opened my eyes. A man in a bright yellow parka was kneeling over me. Behind him, a helicopter was idling on a sandbar, its rotors kicking up a storm of mud and water. The pilot of the bush plane had seen the flare, but he was low on fuel. He had radioed my coordinates to a search and rescue team 200 miles away. They lifted me onto a stretcher. As the helicopter rose into the air, I looked out the window. I saw the river, the plateau, and far in the distance, the tiny silver glint of old Max, the plane that had been my prison and my sanctuary. I looked at the seat next to me. The ghost in the wool coat was gone. He didn't belong in this world of noise and light. I reached out and grabbed the sleeve of the paramedic. I couldn't speak, but he understood. He squeezed my hand. "It's over, Arthur," he said. "You're back." I looked at the clock on the instrument panel. The second hand was moving. Tick, tock, tick, tock. I had missed 40 days of my life, but as the warmth of the cabin seeped into my bones, I realized I had never been more alive than I was in that white, silent void. You have just witnessed the 40-day journey of Arthur Vance, a testament to the fact that the human spirit is the strongest substance on this planet. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own strength, please subscribe and leave a comment with the word unbroken. We tell these stories not just to entertain, but to remember that no matter how deep the snow or how long the silence,
A
the
rug it
next is
is.
always
I
worth
remember
fighting
the day
for.
we first met.
Thank you
It
for
was a
staying
crisp
with us
autumn
for these three
afternoon, and the
hours.
leaves
Until the next horizon calls, stay strong.